Hello, welcome Dr. Sushma Singh this side. Today in Unit 20 Economic, Social and Cultural Dimensions of Globalization. Let us start the lecture with the topic International Trade Regulatory Body WTO. After the Second World War, steps were taken by countries around the globe to regulate world trade by proposing to set up an international trade organization, ITO, along the lines of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, a world body to facilitate international liquidity, and the World Bank, a sectoral lending institution. When ITO could not materialize due to the various reasons, 23 nations around the globe agreed to continue trade negotiations that were eventually incorporated in the General Trade Agreement on Tariff and Trade (GATT), which formally came into existence in October 1947. This increased the role of the trade during the post-World War II period. This was accompanied by the reduction in tariff barriers gradually both in developing and developed countries due partly to autonomous policies and partly to the series of multilateral trade rounds under GATT. In the eighth round of GATT negotiations, popularly known as the Uruguay round, the contracting parties agreed to establish the World Trade Organization WTO to undertake multilateral trade negotiations. The World Trade Organization, which came into being on 1st January 1995, replacing GATT, is an international organization setting out the global rules of trade between nations. Whereas the GATT was a bilateral agreement, WTO is an organizational setup, which means that any decision of the organization is applicable to all the members nations. The stated aim of WTO is to provide a global decision-making structure of setting and enforcing rules in relation to the international trade. The WTO Secretariat is based in Geneva. Its main function is to ensure that international trade flows smoothly, predictably, and as freely as possible. In 2005, 148 countries were members of WTO, accounting for 97% of the world trade, and more countries are compelled to be members of WTO. Decisions are made by the entire membership of WTO, and the agreements have to be ratified by the parliament of each and every member nation. The WTO's top-level decision-making body is the Ministerial Conference, which meets at least once every 2 years. The fifth WTO Ministerial Conference was held in Cancun, Mexico in September 2003. The main functions of WTO are administering trade agreements, maintaining a forum for trade negotiations, handling trade disputes, monitoring national trade policies, technical assistance and training for developing countries, and cooperation with other international organizations. WTO became an important player in regulating global trade. It became the more significant to have a World Trade Regulatory Body as trade liberalization gradually increased during the 1990s. The share of world exports in the world GDP rose from about 6% in 1950 to 12% in 1973 and to 16% in 1992. WTO trade agreements are mainly in goods, services, intellectual property, dispute settlement, and policy review. Trade agreements in goods deal with all aspects such as the lower custom duty rates and other trade barriers, as well as with specific sectors such as agriculture and textile, and specific issues such as state trading, product standards, subsidies, and actions taken against dumping. The service sector includes banks, insurance firms, telecommunications, tour operators, hotel chains, and transport companies. All these now enjoy freer and fair trade. The intellectual property agreement amounts to rules for trade and investment in ideas and creativity. The WTO system encourages countries to settle differences through consultations. Countries bring disputes to WTO if they think their rights under the agreements are being infringed upon. The trade policy review mechanism of WTO proposes to improve transparency in national policies of individual countries. The WTO has a range of rules designed to prohibit trade relations investment measures, TRIMs, including many of the ways in which national government might seek to develop industry and investment, policies to assist the development of industries and firms. The WTO rules in relation to trade-related intellectual property provide unprecedented protection in the areas of copyright and intellectual property rights. The existing agreements of the national government with WTO require domestic legislation and policies of member states to be altered and brought into the line with it. Non-compliance can result in trade sanctions being imposed against a country's export through the dispute settlement system, thus giving WTO a strong enforcement mechanism. Thus, national governments have to comply with the disciplines and obligations in the wide range of issues under the purview of WTO. The functioning of WTO promotes the empowerment of the market or the minimal role of the state and rapid liberalization. India is a founder member of the GATT and its successor, the WTO. India's participation in an increasingly rule-based system in the governance of the international trade is claimed to ensure more stability and predictability, which may lead to more trade and prosperity. By being a member of WTO, India automatically avails most favored nation and national treatment for its export to all WTO nations. India made necessary legislative changes to implement WTO standard intellectual property laws in the year 2005, although after showing initial resistance. Here we want to close this lecture. Thanks for patientful hearing.